tālāk pieslēgsimies Igaunijai, vijoļu meistarei Helinai Pihlapai, par kuru mums mazliet pastāstīs tautas mūzikas speciālists Ilmārs.
Paldies! Tātad mūsu šodienas nākamā dalībniece ir no mūsu ziemeļu kaimiņu zemes Igaunijas, vijoļniece un vijoļspēles skolotāja no Tartu Helina Pihlapa. Viņa ir Tartu lielākā folkloras kluba mātes vadītāja, un viņi šajā klubā padziļināti interesējas par visu to dažādo Igaunijas folkloras mantojumu, tajā skaitā arī instrumentu spēli. Un Helīna mums šodien gatavosies stāstīt tieši par Dienvidigaunijas vijoļspēles tradīciju, un to mums ir jāņem vērā, jo mēs robežojamies tieši ar šo Igaunijas daļu, un diezgan tāda liela muzikālā miedarbība ir saskatāma arī mūsu tradicionālajā mantojumā. Helīna, palun!
Aitäh! Good day and welcome to Estonia. My name is Helin. I'm here with Kirke, my student, who will help me demonstrate some things. And we will be talking about the traditional violin playing in Estonia and some of the most famous players from Estonia. We are at the Estonian National Museum in Tartu. And today they are hosting a very big dance competition, so maybe you will see some dancers in the background. So, yeah. The violin became popular in Estonia in the 18th century in the villages. In the cities it became popular during the 17th century already. And then during the next 100 years, the violin became the most popular instrument in Estonia. In the beginning, it was the same importance as the bagpipe, and the violin and the bagpipe often played together as well. So we will now demonstrate a piece from the repertoire of a bagpipe, actually. And it's a flat foot waltz. It's a very typical dance in Estonia. You dance it with the whole foot all the time. And we will show you a way of playing together with two violins. That was typical. One violin was playing the melody and the other was just holding a drone, so it would really imitate the bagpipe. Why the violin became more popular than the bagpipe was the new dances that started to become popular, like the polka, Reiländer, polka mazurka, and different types of quadrilles. And the violin was much better to play these kinds of pieces, so the violin became more popular than the bagpipe. The instruments were normally made by the players themselves. It was very normal that when you played the violin, you made the instrument yourself. Some people had instruments they bought, but they preferred to make it themselves because they thought it sounds better. And also when you make your own instrument, you can use some magic to make it sound better. Like we know some violin makers hid pieces of snake tails in their violins, or they blew some vodka steams on the violins, so it would sound better. And every maker had their own secrets, how to get the best sound of the instrument. And in the villages, there were two types of violin players. There were these so-called virtuosos. There were maybe one or two in each village of these kinds of players. And they were the players that were invited to all the weddings, all the important events, and all the parties. And then there were also players who just played at home for family events or just played at home. And these you could really find in every home. The violin was very, very popular. And at the end of the 19th century, the violin was typically played together with another violin, or the bagpipe, or a buttoned accordion, or kannel, and later mandolin. But at the end of the 19th century, they also had these big ensembles of violins, and musicians would even play the music from the scores. During the 1930s, they recorded a lot of the violinists, but by then there were not many good violinists left, and by now the tradition has broken completely. But we have quite a lot of archive recordings to learn from, which is very, very nice. The style of violin playing in Estonia, of course, it is different for each player. But there are some things that are more or less the same in all over Estonia. Normally, for example, the players, they don't use any vibrato. In Estonian folk music, you don't really hear that. There are lots of double stops, normally with another open string. The tunes are normally for dancing, so they have short and very accented bow strokes. And the left hand normally stays in first position. Very, very rarely they maybe stretch the fourth finger, or they use third position as well, but normally just the first position. The ornamentation is not very complicated, but improvising and variations are of course normal. And the technique, some players held the violin on their shoulder, like in classical music as well. Some players had their violin on the chest because they believed it's better to watch the dancers. Your neck can move freely and you can sing along and you can see what's going on. For the bow, some players held the bow from more the middle, some players put the little finger under the bow because they felt that gave them more strength or some stability. So that was an interesting thing you can see in many of the photos. And now we will play another tune, Suis läbi polka. It's from near Vijoļu, and you can hear this more or less typical Estonian style of violin playing. Some of the most famous players of southern Estonia. The first one I want to introduce is Vijoļu. She is special for many reasons. One of the reasons is that she is the only female violin player that we know from Estonia. She was born in 1870 near Vijoļu, and she learned the violin from her father when she was 8 years old. She was a very good player, but we know her more as a singer, so they have actually recorded quite a lot of songs from her, but only 3 violin pieces. But in the pieces, you can hear this kind of typical violin playing. The tunes are normally in D or G major. They often have double stops with open strings. And the interesting thing about her is that the second finger is not very precise. She uses the same position on every string, no matter what the key is that she's playing in. So yeah, it sounds all the same on every string, and so it always sounds a little bit out of tune. We will play an example of her violin playing. It's an old waltz that you can dance this flat foot waltz to. Vana valss. Then the next violin player is from more south, from Urvaste, which is around 40 kilometers from Valga. His name was Ott Hiop. He was born in 1865. And he's probably one of the most well-known southern Estonian violin players. He started playing when he was just a young shepherd, when he was 11 or 12 years old. He made his own first violin using just a little pocket knife, but by the time he was 16, he was already a famous wedding musician and he had a good violin. And he is quite a virtuosic player, and he has maybe not a very traditional playing style, but it's definitely very unique. He sometimes even used the vibrato. Normally only maybe at the last notes of the piece. He also played in some very unusual keys like C major or F major, which is not that comfortable on the violin. And he used more difficult double stops and chords. And this lets us guess that he probably heard some classical music in the cities maybe, and that he was influenced by this. So I will play a piece that he played. It's a polka, and he used a lot of legato as well, which is also not that typical in this kind of way. So that would be an example of how he played alone. But Ott often played together with another violin player, Kristjan Joakit. They were playing together with two violins, and they played in a very interesting manner. We heard before how you could play with two violins when one plays the melody and the other just holds the drone. They had a different approach. Ott visited Tartu, and he heard the violin ensembles playing in the city, and he was inspired by this. And he liked how the second violins were always playing this kind of secunda. And he taught Kristjan Joakit to play in this manner as well. So they would play together, and Ott would play the melody, and Kristjan Joakit would play this kind of secunda. And we will demonstrate this as well. So this is kind of inspired by classical music maybe, but they always played by ear and they never used any scores. The violinist he played together with, Kristjan Joakit, he was also a very good violinist on his own, and he also made his own first violin when he was a young shepherd. He started learning the violin when he was 10 years old, and he said he knew about 100 pieces by heart. And when he played in weddings, his salary was either 1 ruble per day or a pair of mittens from the bride. So these were two very famous players both during their time and also now. We know their tunes very well. There are quite a lot of recordings. And Ott and Kristjan Joakit. But then there was another famous violin duo near Pärnu, Mihkel Toom and Mart Jansson. Mihkel Toom was born in 1873, and he was one of the most famous violin players from Pärnu region. His father played the violin, his grandfather played the violin, and he started playing the violin when he was 6 years old. And when he was 18, he was already a famous wedding musician. He was very energetic, and when he was playing, standing up, he would always stomp his feet in rhythm. And he often played together with Mart Jansson. They recorded 21 pieces with this duo. But when they were presenting all the pieces to choose what to record, they took 7.5 hours to just play through the pieces. They had around 51 different pieces and they never repeated anything. So they had quite a lot of repertoire together. And both players had quite the traditional playing style, and they both learned from their fathers. But at the same time, we know that they were influenced by another player in their region who actually studied in the Paris Conservatory. So they are also a little bit influenced by classical musician. And the person, the other violinist, the second violin, was Mart Jansson, and he was also a very dedicated musician. He really wanted to spend all his time practicing and touring. And that gave him many arguments with his wife, because the wife was angry because he never did any farm work, he was just practicing. But he had many performances, they were very popular, and the dates of all the events were fixed so that he could come and play. And he was one of the few players that could improvise this kind of second voice to the melody and do so without any scores. And he wouldn't play this drone, he wouldn't play this kind of secunda, but he had a lower second voice that was normally like a third lower than the melody, and it was always a third lower than the melody. So if it was a tune that was in major, then on the last chord we would want to change this one note so it would sound in major, but he would just play a third down and it would kind of sound minor during a major key, so it gives this interesting color to it. And we will show you this as well. Tori poika. So that was another example of how two violins would play together. And now another player I would like to introduce is Aksel Vassila. And he's a special player. He was born in 1901 in my home village, actually. And he has also a very unique playing style. He sounds very classical. He uses a lot of vibrato. He uses very high positions. He uses very complicated double stops, and he sounds very, very classical. But in the interviews during the archive recordings, he said that he has never studied anywhere. So we don't know where that comes from. And in the recordings, his violin sounds lower. It sounds a third lower than the standard string nowadays. So the lower strings sound especially deep. And everything else about this player is a mystery. He was recorded in the 1960s, but we don't know anything about him. And I've tried to trace him and find out more information about him, but so far I haven't really managed to find anything, which is interesting because it wasn't that long ago, but there is nothing to be found. So I don't know much about him, but he sounds very special. He has these very romantic kind of classical sounding pieces, but then he also has these very traditional sounding pieces. And so yeah, he was a very interesting musician. and I will play something from him. And I have another violin with me, so I could show you how it sounded in his recordings when the violin was tuned lower. I will play two pieces by him. The first one is a polka. You can hear some of the complicated double stops here already, but it still sounds kind of traditional sometimes. So that's quite a piece. And the other one I will play for you is a waltz that he played. And that's even more complicated. It uses a lot of high positions, a lot of double stops, and was a lot of fun to learn from my recording. All the pieces we play today, we have learned them from the actual recordings of the players. And this will be my last tune. So if you have any questions, you can think about them during this little waltz. And yeah. So, thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. If not, we thank you for inviting us. The last presentation was very interesting and we are really looking forward to the rest of the day as well. So, thank you very much.
One question we have, and it is how traditional music violinists are choosing their instrument. Do they specially order, or any violin is good to play folk music?
You mean if there are any special tunings nowadays, or?
How it's happening nowadays? If people are wondering to play folk music, do they order special violin for folk music playing, or any instrument is good enough to play?
I think any instrument is good. We normally use the standard tuning nowadays, and yeah, I don't use anything special for. I play both folk music and classical, and I have the same instrument for both. I know people who maybe choose the strings to be a certain material for either folk or classical, but mostly, yeah, the instrument can be the same, the tuning is the same, and yeah, it's not the same.
Is there any master in Estonia who are making specially folk music instruments, also violins?
I wouldn't say so. I know makers who are making violins who are specialized in folk music, but the instruments are very good. They can be used for classical or folk music. Or I don't know that anyone makes instruments especially for only folk music. Yeah, I think they're more or less standard violins.
Thank you for your answer.